This man convinced dozens of people that he could speak directly to God. People abandoned their families, left their jobs, and followed him into the wilderness because he claimed the end of the world was coming. Years later, some survivors would describe him as a monster. Others would say they had been living with the devil himself. His name was Thériault, and he would become the leader of one of the most disturbing cults in Canadian history. The group became known as the Ant Hill Kids. But before there was a cult, there was a young woman named Gabrielle. Like many others, she believed Rock was different. He was charismatic, confident, and people trusted him. Gabrielle trusted him too. Years later, she would help bring his empire crashing down. But at the time, she believed she was following a man chosen by God. In the 1970s, Rock began telling people something extraordinary. He claimed that God spoke directly to him, that society was doomed, and that only those who followed him would survive what was coming. At first, only a handful of people believed him. Then more arrived, and more. Before long, Rock had gathered a loyal group of followers willing to trust him with their lives. Then, he told them it was time to leave. Families abandoned everything they knew and followed him into the remote wilderness of Quebec. There, Rock established a commune called Eternal Mountain. Far from police, far from family, far from anyone who might challenge his authority. At first, life seemed simple. Followers built a new life in the wilderness and waited for the end of the world. But the apocalypse never came. Instead, Rock's control continued to grow. He dictated how people lived, who they spoke to, and eventually convinced followers that obedience to him was obedience to God. Gabrielle watched it happen. The man she had once admired was becoming someone else. Then Rock crossed another line. He claimed that all the women belonged to him. Over time, he took multiple wives, fathered dozens of children, and tightened his control over the group. Fear gradually replaced faith. Then, Rock became obsessed with medicine. Despite having no medical training whatsoever, he began diagnosing illnesses, treating injuries, and performing medical procedures. Many followers trusted him. That trust would have devastating consequences. A 2-year-old boy named Samuel became seriously ill. Instead of seeking proper medical care, Rock insisted that he could help. What followed ended in tragedy. Samuel did not survive. Authorities eventually investigated. The commune was raided. Children were removed, and Rock was arrested. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over, but it wasn't. Rock was eventually released. And, almost unbelievably, many followers returned. Gabrielle returned too. Years inside, the cult had changed everything. Leaving no longer felt simple, and the worst years of the cult were still ahead. By the mid-1980s, followers lived in constant fear. Gabrielle watched people suffer. She watched injuries pile up, and she began questioning the man she had once trusted. Then came the turning point. Gabrielle suffered a serious injury and was taken to a hospital. Doctors immediately realized something was wrong. Questions were asked. Authorities were notified. And for the first time in years, investigators began looking closely at what had been happening inside the cult. As the investigation expanded, former members began speaking. Survivors came forward, and Rock's carefully constructed image began to collapse. Then investigators uncovered another disturbing case. A woman named Solange Boilard had died inside the cult years earlier. Her death had never been properly explained. As authorities re-examined the evidence, they concluded it was not an accident. The case against Rock became impossible to ignore. The man who had once convinced followers he could speak to God was finally losing control. Thériault was ultimately convicted in connection with Solange Boilard's death and sentenced to life in prison. The man who once controlled every aspect of his followers' lives would spend the rest of his own behind bars. Then, in 2011, Thériault was killed by a fellow inmate. He was 63 years old. His death marked the end of one of Canada's most notorious cult leaders. But it did not erase the damage he left behind. Families had been torn apart. Children had grown up surrounded by fear and control. And survivors spent years rebuilding lives shaped by manipulation and abuse. The story of the Ant Hill Kids isn't just about a cult leader. It's about ordinary people who were convinced to trust the wrong person. And by the time many realized the truth, some had already lost everything.